CLIL Discussion 7, Use of L1 in the Classroom, recorded on the 16th of September 2009.
In terms of agenda, I wanted to report back on a meeting I've just been at in Germany, which is very interesting, and I wondered if the rest of you might want to chip in with just some of your recent work news, if you've been at conferences or projects you've been working on. And then we've got our theme, which is using L1 in the classroom. Is that okay?
That's fine.
That's fine.
Well, the place I've been to is actually Kassel in Germany, where I gave a plenary paper at the fourth conference for bilingual science teachers. And it's interesting for a number of reasons, because there were 140 people at the conference, all bilingual science teachers in Germany, and the theme was very varied. And it's a conference which is growing from strength to strength, I imagine, because science is one of the most popular subjects taught through English as a foreign language in Germany. The reason I wanted to mention it is because it's relevant to our theme, because the use of L1 in classrooms where it's taught bilingually in Germany is kind of ignored, I think. It's a theme which teachers ignore by just opting into the foreign language and getting on with teaching their subjects through the foreign language without really focusing on the role of language within their subjects. Now, that might set us off on a discussion, but let's put it on pause. I wondered if any of you would like to contribute with some catching up with news from your own working context.
Well, the focus with me at the moment is on intercultural learning, really. Since we haven't got a course of bilingual teachers this term, so we are hoping for another one next year. So I've just come back from a conference and in-service training on intercultural learning. But I think there are some parallels as well. It's about, getting content into language teaching and being more focused on the contents and less on the language details and the language structure and grammar and things like that.
What's your subject, Bernd?
My subject is English. I'm an English teacher, and history. So history would be my content subject.
Okay. And where are you based?
I'm based in Karlsruhe in the southwest of Germany.
Okay.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Tell us your latest news.
I'm running with the team of Gisela a training course for CLIL teachers in Sardinia. So we are training teachers in CLIL, and we are running a course using a blended approach. So using ICT and some face-to-face meetings. And I am one of the trainers together with Fabrizio and Francesca and all the Italian team. And I am also preparing my contribution to the seminar in Turku next week, because I will present there some results of the first phase of my research about the CLIL subject teacher in Italy and Spain. So I have just elaborated all the data, all the questionnaire we distributed in Spain and in Italy, and I'm going to present some of the results. So I'll be there next week.
Okay.
So I just want to ask, what's the focus of the research, Loretta?
The focus of the research was the profile of the CLIL subject teachers, and we will analyze not only professional experiences but also life stories. So with a narrative approach also in the analysis of the information we will gather. So we will.
Sorry, go on.
I'm sorry, I don't hear very well.
No, go on, sorry.
I was going to say, Lauretta, is your research ongoing? Because I
yes,
know you...
Yes, we have. I've just elaborated the data from the questionnaires, and I am beginning the second phase, that is to say, the interviews, focus groups, and live stories.
Okay.
It is ongoing.
I know you sent me a questionnaire, and it's one of my jobs when we finish today to put it on the website. I hope you're still collecting questionnaires from teachers.
Yes, but this will be a kind of enlargement of the research, because the focus is on Spanish and Italian teachers. And if I get a questionnaire from other European teachers, this will be an added value of the research to compare what I have found in Italy and Spain with the situation in other European or other countries outside Europe.
That's great. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't holding up your research by not publishing your questionnaire so quickly.
No.
That's great. And John, what have you been up to recently?
Well, I've been working in Qatar. I don't know if the others know that you've been working there too, Keith. In maths and science support through English. And they have just come together in the first year of that work. Also been working a little on language and literacy. So education happens through the medium of English in both those countries.
That's very interesting, and it's a country which is going to be under the microscope, I think, for a few years to come, isn't it, Qatar?
Qatar, I think it is, yeah.
I came back from Kassel via Switzerland. I went to the Swiss Association of English Teachers conference in Basel, where they were having a SIG day, and one of the threads of the day was CLIL.
Okay.
And I spoke there about embedding language within tasks, and I mention it because it's part of a week of really interesting encounters with other teachers who are interested in integrating content and language. Almost 200 teachers over the course of a week in just 2 countries. And I know this issue of use of L1 is a hot issue everywhere. And the way I thought we could talk about it, say for the next half an hour, 40 minutes, is really, if each of us could give maybe about a minute just saying what our standpoint is on use of L1 in the classroom, and then we could throw it open for a bit of open discussion and see where we get. If we can come to some list of principled ideas at the end of the discussion, I think that will be a great result. How does that sound?
Fine.
Is that okay? Well, maybe, I don't know if there's somebody who would like to jump in straight away and tell us what they think of this theme, L1 in the content classroom.
Perhaps I could say a couple of things very quickly. I think it's a terribly important thing. I don't think a lot of CLIL teachers can really do without using the first language, and I don't think a lot of CLIL learners can do without it either. So it's crucial, depending on the level of language ability of the teacher, depending on the level of language ability of the learner. As far as code switching is concerned, I think learners and teachers just need to do it. So it's a question of how much they do it and what the sort of ground rules of doing it are. It also, I think the degree to which teachers and learners code switch depends on their level of language, but awful lot of learning in a second language takes place with teachers who are not so confident and learners who are definitely not so confident. So that's one issue. I think also there is an issue about pair work and group work. That again, depending on the level of language of the learners, pair work and group work tends to happen in the first language, which I think is a terribly natural thing to happen. So the first language tends to be this sort of private language of the classroom, and the second language can often be the public language of the classroom. And I think a related issue here is that sometimes, especially in group work, kids need to do it in their first language. At least sometimes they need to do it in their first language, because if they don't do it, they don't get an in-depth enough understanding of the concepts that they're dealing with. So I think there are various reasons why using the first language is a good thing, but I think we have to be clear about the different purposes for which we use it, and when it becomes a barrier to learning.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? You notice I'm trying to keep take a step back, because I think I dominate a little bit sometimes when it's a topic I'm very interested in. Somebody else, carry on, please.
Well, I think, yes, Loretta, go ahead.
Yes, I agree that it is a question of how much and when. So it's a question of how much first language both the teacher and the student use, and also when. So if we accept the idea that there is a public and a private language, maybe this could be a good approach. According to some results of my research, the use of the mother tongue decreases with the increase of the competence of the subject teachers. So, if the subject teacher has a very high competence in the target language, then he tends to use and to ask the students to use less the mother tongue, the first language, and more the second language. And this is clearly connected. And if the subject teacher has a lower competence in the foreign language, then he tends to use generally a 50-50, tends to use 50-50, so the two languages. In some cases, the use of, in Italy especially, where the competence is lower than in Spain, for example, the use of the foreign language is even less than 50%. And it is sometimes very mixed, not only a public use of the language, but very mixed. So yeah. I think that 50% could be acceptable if we speak of CLIL, not of only a general bilingual education approach.
Yeah.
If you look at CLIL from the traditional language teaching point, then you must say that in traditional language teaching you tend to stress the use of the target language. Even if we have a new approach that says it's okay if you use L1, but the problem is with teachers that they tend to stress the use of the target language, whereas students try to avoid, because they feel more at home with L1. And the problem is, how much. I totally agree with that. And we have a concept here that Wolfgang Puttkamp brought into the community, and it's called using L1 as communicative lubricant. So don't only use it to make things clear which are not clear before, and try to communicate in the target language. So there's still a quite strict focus on the target language. Things that you want to communicate, do it in the target language. If you have to get things clear about lexical things or something like that, you can do this in L1. And, that's the tenet, basically, that I know. And I try to keep it, because I know that in the classroom, the students tend to overuse the L1, because it's just, they are more familiar with it, they feel more at home, they try to avoid mistakes, language teachers try to avoid mistakes and things like that. So I think it's a difficult point really.
Sure. I mean, there are lots of variables, aren't there? The language competence of the teacher, the language competence of the learners, their background knowledge within the subject as well.
If you
Yep.
if train the language teachers, what sometimes we think about is what does it mean to the students if you start talking in L1? It means that you tell them you can't do it in the target language. It's too difficult for you. Maybe it's too difficult for the teacher. So the signal would be try to paraphrase in the target language if you don't know how to do it. But with CLIL, obviously, it's different because you have content matter to discuss and to bring across. So here we have a different approach. And I find it because I'm training language teachers as well as CLIL people, and I see, in a way, a sort of contradiction because you have different aims in, language and in CLIL teaching. You have parallels, but there are also differences, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major differences is that the focus in the subject lessons comes from the subject curriculum most of the time, doesn't it? Whereas in the language classroom, we tend to have lexis, functions and grammar leading whatever happens in the classroom.
That's it. And students tend to try and avoid the difficulty, trying to practice L1, trying to practice target language by, overusing L1. I don't know what the experience is of John and Loretta and Yuki.
Yeah. Well, I personally, I find it varies from place to place, and it never ceases to amaze me how students succeed in their science lessons, for example, in their second or third language, in ways which seem to be beyond what they are doing in their English lessons or their other foreign language lessons. I don't think I have a clear strategy for success for using the languages in the classroom, but I think there are techniques that teachers use. I think, as Lauretta was suggesting, that the things you set up in the classroom, the awareness you have of the level of language of the learners and how much they can already cope with, setting up pair work in a way that can support their production of the second language is a strategic decision the teacher can take. And I think that it comes back to awareness of the learners and the profiles of learners, but also teachers asking questions about tasks in their classrooms. I remember Doe Coyle talking about having a vision for every lesson, and I suppose that the message she was giving is not a global vision, although that's very important, but very simple visions. If we want learners to talk in their subject lessons, how do we actually enable them to talk in a foreign language in the subject lessons? And I think those are things teachers can plan very strategically. In the same way, they meet the demands of their national curriculum guidelines for their subjects. They can also plan to support speaking, for example, in their subject lessons.
Yes, if I may add something, I would like to stress, and this is my point of view and experience as a trainer, that the decision to use more or less the first language should not depend on the competence of the teachers, but on the vision he has or she has, or the lesson she or he is going to carry out. Because most teachers, for example, who fill the questionnaire, they ask for training in language, but not for training in CLIL. And this is, I think this is really astonishing, because most of subject teachers are convinced that it is enough to master a language to be a CLIL teacher. And this is a problem, I think. because it's not so automatically true that if you can teach a subject, you can teach a subject in a foreign language.
I totally agree. There's more to teaching to teaching CLIL than to teaching language just.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you think about, to pick up on Bernd's point there, what do you feel, colleagues, about the idea of teaching the subject in the mother tongue and then going over the same ground in the foreign language?
To repeat, you mean to repeat the same lesson or something like that in a foreign language?
Yeah, or it's not exactly the same lesson, but the same subject area, because I know that does happen in some contexts.
I don't know enough about it myself. I mean, I think you're right. It does happen in some versions of bilingual education, but I don't know enough about how it works. I think also there's a limit to the extent that you can. I mean, there is a sort of there's a boredom risk, isn't there? I mean, there is an advantage. I think there's always an advantage because if you approach doing a subject in a second language where you have already studied quite a lot of it in the first language, it's obviously a lot easier to do it in the second language. There's an easiness advantage. I think there's a big boredom disadvantage.
Yeah. I mention it because I once observed a lesson in religious studies in Latvia, which was given simultaneously in Russian, English and Latvian. All three languages were used in the same lesson, and it was the same contents, not repeated over and over, but the three languages were almost joined together in one continuous flow from the same teacher. And I think my point is really that because there is a movement within bilingual education, and I think immersion education and CLIL, which is saying that the L1 is a good thing, and I agree it is, but I think it has to be strategic and planned. The teacher needs to know why and when and how it's going to be used.
I would think it's the same lesson again. It should have a different approach, a different perspective. It should somehow vary from what you did before, because of the boring effect that John mentioned, and also it's more intellectually demanding if you have different aspects.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, I do think, if I can just say, I think this is actually a complex topic, and you know, every time I think about it, I think we need to be really clear about what we mean by the use of the first language. I mean, I think we do need to be clear about, for example, what types of use we're talking about, whether it's just a quick translation of a word, or whether it's a fairly long explanation, or whether it's, for example, you know, using even as in some lessons that I've seen, using the first language for a lot of oral work and using the second language for reading and writing. I think there's a question of types. I think also there's an issue about what point in the lesson. I think at some point, sometimes it's more useful to use the first language at one point in the lesson and not to use it at a later point in the lesson. I mean, technically, it ought to be a little easier for the kids to avoid using the first language later on in the lesson once they've got used to a particular concept. And I think also there's another variable is, you know, interactional forms. Are we talking about using it in the plenary classroom? We teach a group interaction in the plenary classroom, or are we talking about using it in pair and group work? And I think also there's an issue about whether it's used by the teacher with relation to their own language. In other words, they suddenly come to a point where they cannot themselves make themselves explicit unless they do a quick translation, or whether it's with relation to learner language competence. In other words, the teacher might be very fluent themselves, but they explicitly offer the child an opportunity to use the first language because they know that child at that point needs it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think there are lots and lots of complex variables. It's a very large umbrella term, and we would need to sort of break it down in ways like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think that brings us back to strategy and planning, doesn't it, John?
Yes.
Because
Yes, it does.
You know, I mean, I had a conversation in Germany with a teacher who said, surely you can't do anything in the foreign language if your students can't understand you. And they were telling me that they'd made a decision to do their teaching in German. And I think they were looking for a bit of approval in explaining that. And that they would do the easier bits in the foreign language. And I think that's a strategic decision, and it's very valid for a teacher to make that kind of decision.
It is. And it's also very contextual. You know, in that group of teachers, they know what kind of level of language ability their kids have, and they take strategic decisions like that in order to facilitate learning. Whereas, you know, another group of teachers in another context, maybe in another country, I don't know, with high teacher competence and high learner competence, like, for example, in Holland or Nordic, they may be able to get by with a lot less reference to the first language than other groups where teacher competence and learner competence is not so high, especially where learner competence is not so high, learner language competence.
And I think I just want to throw another point in about planning, John, because I think it comes back to what both Loretta and Bernd have said, so we can ask them what they think. John and I have run a workshop where we focused on lesson planning very clearly, and I think there are questions about language within the lesson plan templates that we used, and maybe this is an area which we could upload those lesson plans as a focus for discussion amongst our wider audience of colleagues, because within the lesson plans, teachers can be asking themselves those preparatory questions. Am I going to use the L1 here? And it may be related to more complex content or more abstract content. But I do think that the question relates to task, because it doesn't necessarily we can't take it for granted that in pair and group work learners are going to use their mother tongue. If the teachers have made a decision to try and support and encourage the foreign language within pair and group work in their planning stage.
Sorry, I didn't get that very last bit, Keith.
I was saying that the lesson plan itself, much as teachers are very busy with the everyday life as teaching, the lesson plan itself can be a good place to identify the code switching, whether it's complex content or abstract content, but also strategic decisions about supporting language within pair and group work. You can see those things in the lesson plan. Because there's a very risk that your learners will go back to the mother tongue. Maybe the plan itself can be a place to decide about providing language support to try to encourage them not to use the mother tongue.
Yeah.
Well, there's a sort of echo in my line. I can't really understand clearly, but what I got from Keith is that we shouldn't take for granted that students switch back to the mother tongue as soon as they are on their own. And I completely agree, because I think if you look at language teaching, you say using the language in a small group or in pair work is a way of training without having all the other students listen. It's a sort of a protected area where you can train and use and do something without having, you know, everybody listening, where you're not inhibited. So I think I totally agree that it depends, and you should provide language material and so on for the students to make it possible for them to use the target language in small groups, in pair work. I just, today I used the double circle in a language class, which was very successful. Students liked it, welcoming each other after the holidays, telling stories, asking questions, not to the whole group, but just to a partner. So I think this could be very useful for CLIL as well.
Yeah. But I do think it depends on what you want the pair work and group work to achieve. If really what you want to achieve is in-depth understanding of a subject concept, I think it's very often a good idea for pair and group work to be conducted partly or maybe even fully in the first language, even with very fluent kids, because they now and then they need parent group work in the first language just to be able to check through that they understand the concept very well. And also, I think, sort of counterintuitively, what happens when they do work through a concept and just discuss it, a concept which has just been taught in the second language, they work through it and talk through it in the first language, I think it enables them to talk about it better later in the second language. You know what I mean? The fact that they've been able to talk it through in the first language enables them later, maybe in the plenary classroom, to be able to talk about it in the second language. Whereas sometimes if kids don't get the opportunity to work through a concept in the first language, it is very difficult for them then to be able to talk about it in the second language. So, you know, our idea of what should happen in pair and group work in foreign language lessons is, I think, very different from our idea of what should happen in pair and group work in content lessons.
Yeah, I see your point, Joe. I completely agree with what you say. It depends on the focus, on the aim you have in this sequence of the lesson.
Yes, it does.
Well, see that if you are focusing on the concept, you can help the students to deal with it in L1.
Yeah.
I think there is one area that it's interesting for me to throw out to everybody in the group to hear your opinions. I think we'll all agree, but I'd quite like to have it recorded, and that's the issue of code switching, where I'm referring particularly to the Johnson and Swain book about Immersion Education International Perspective, which I put in the web page as a reference for everybody before our discussion, where they talk about code switching in Hong Kong, and they talk about code switching in Canada, almost at opposites of one scale, and the problems identified in Hong Kong are where the foreign language is almost exclusively used, at least in these examples, to give terminology, and then the mother tongue is used for all the explanation and all the teacher talk and all the student talk. And so it actually becomes nothing more than delivery of terms and content through the foreign language.
Yeah.
It looks like discussion is going on, but actually it's not foreign language discussion through content, it's all happening in the mother tongue. And I suspect that happens a lot in CLIL context globally.
Yeah.
I've certainly seen it here in Bulgaria.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, I think that it is clearly much more than that, and that I agree with John that, for example, when students are working in group or in pair, maybe the use of first language is a kind of way to check if they understood, and to reach to make a decision about what to do, and to use some to develop also their ability to interact in the mother tongue and to take the decision in the mother tongue. But when they work in plenary, they can use mainly the target language and develop other kind of skills, other kind of competencies.
I think you're right. I mean, to pick up John's point, it's about context, isn't it? All these contexts are very different, Lauretta. But I will throw an example out from the Canada context, where a description of a school was given where with early learners, the teachers are working almost entirely in the foreign language, but the mother tongue from the students was welcomed, but all the responses from the teachers were given in the foreign language.
Right.
And you can imagine, students talking all around the classroom in their mother tongue, and the teachers replying in the foreign language. I imagine to start with, it's quite problematic. But the richness of that input for the learners, who are all speaking in their own language, there's lots of clarification and repetition going on in their own language, is actually going to lead for a small number of learners initially to mother tongue take up in the foreign language, and eventually the rich input is going to lead to more and more learners taking up the foreign language.
That's very interesting.
I don't think that happens a lot in CLIL contexts, and I'm generalising when I say that, but I think the assumption is they can't understand it unless you explain it in their mother tongue. In a lot of
I think it's probably a feature of early CLIL or early bilingual education, isn't it? Where kids simply start with zero second language ability. I mean, in Qatar, for example, we have no idea what happens in their year one classes when they start doing maths and science in English. But I imagine what happens is the kids basically use their first language, and the teachers use their second language where they can. But I imagine that what you've just described probably does happen in early years English medium science and maths. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This sounds to be more of an immersion concept, more of immersion language learning than what we can do with the secondary classes we have, older teachers we have. It would be very interesting for me to know how long it takes for the students to follow their teacher and start, speaking the target language.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
As far as I see in my context, students need some encouragement. They need some holding to use the target language. It's very, but maybe with younger teachers where you have implicit learning, where you have immersion and so on. So it sounds very interesting. It would be very, very interesting for me to hear, how long it takes and how, which steps the students take to follow their teachers.
And well, the example in Bulgaria, Bent, which is very different to the context described in the immersion education international perspectives that I made reference to. A lot of the students in Bulgaria have this intensive preparatory year where they have nothing but English for 18 hours a week for the first year. So they have mathematics and music and PE, but 18 hours of English for a whole year, and then they go on to do their content in the foreign language. So you can imagine that I could say it takes them a year to be able to cope with their lessons in the foreign language. But I think they're just lucky having that intensive language input before going on with the content lessons. It's a factor which I've not met in any other countries, apart from Romania and Hungary, but numbers are very, very small where they have this intensive preparatory year.
And after this first year, what would you gauge the amount of L1 then in CLIL?
Well, the students can pretty much cope with everything teachers throw at them after the intensive preparatory year, more or less, I would say. But that's because they're dragged along by these schools that have them do their curriculum through foreign languages. I mean, it's very teacher-led, very intensive. The content is intensive, and the materials are very dense and intensive. So the students have to keep doggy paddling, or they'll drown. Basically, they keep afloat. But it's not only based on their intensive English or the intensive foreign language preparatory. It's because of the culture of learning that they're put in, as much as the preparatory year they get.
But if I just go back to the question of pair and group work in the first language.
Yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes you can have pair and group work which is in the second language, which is well supported, so the teacher offers a task which provides lots of language support, and the kids basically can do it in the second language, or quite a lot of it in the second language. And then there's, pair and group work in the first language, where the teacher makes a strategic decision to ask the kids to work through it in the first language and make sure they understand it properly. But I think also there are lots of instances of pair and group work where what happens is really an awful lot of language mixing. So, for example, if the kids do discuss a topic for 5 minutes in the first language, if the teacher says at this point, well, I want you to get ready now to report in the plenary classroom in English about what you've been discussing, I think what happens is the kids do a fair amount of talk in the first language and the second language about how they are now going to present formally and more publicly in the plenary classroom what they've been talking about in the first language. And I think that section of the group work where they are getting ready to express in English what they have been talking about in the first language is terribly powerful pedagogically. It's very, very good and useful work. It makes them think very carefully about how to express in English what they have been talking about in the first language. So I think their work, which involves some getting ready for presenting in the second language, is extra pedagogically powerful.
Yeah, it sounds very wise, and I think you're offering a principle which is probably applicable in most contexts. And I wonder if it's possible for us to maybe recap some of those principles, because I'll note them down in maybe one-page form and stick it on our website as a summary of principles. So you could say that some L1 preparatory talk in pair and group work for plenary presentation is a good principle. Would you all agree on that?
Yes, I would agree.
Are there any other ones that you could pick up on, John, Bernd, Laretta, that you think we could recap and summarise?
Well, I think one principle is, I think one principle is that the teachers that a lot of us have been mentioning is that the teacher's purpose is paramount. You know, the teacher's purpose in pair work or group work is to get the kids to understand the concept, and they ask them to talk through it quickly in the first language. If the teacher's purpose is to get them to express an already partially understood concept in the second language, then they give them a task which gives them enough support to be able to conduct that pair work and group work in the second language. In other words, you know, teacher's purpose is really crucial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any others that are clear? I mean, it might not be easy to list them and pick them out, but if there are, do shout them out, because I'll make a note and then I'll tidy it up into like I say, a one-page document.
Well, I think another one that we mentioned at the beginning is just language ability. You know, teachers who are not confident in the second language do themselves sometimes have to code switch to help themselves. And teachers who may be pretty fluent in the second language sometimes have to offer the opportunity to their students to code switch because they know that their students are not confident in the second language. So, you know, language ability among teachers and students is a sort of crucial variable in how much code switching you do.
Yeah. Okay.
Another criteria could be complexity. We talked about the lesson plans and, you know, thinking in advance which parts of the lesson should be, you know, in L1 and L2. And I think if it gets very complex or emotional, there might be a reason for, you know, using L1.
When you say emotional, do you mean when teachers want to communicate with their kids in the normal sort of pretty personal way that teachers sometimes have to do for discipline or for personal reasons? Is that what you mean?
No, I was rather thinking of, you know, if there are discussions in history about, you know, things that might come to a very emotional part where students feel a need to express their, you know, their opinions, their attitudes, but they don't have the language resources to do this. I think at this point there must be, you know, a priority for what they want to express about themselves, about their opinions, and so on. So
that's
there
interesting.
you have to be prepared for, you know, giving room to L1.
Yeah. But I think also, sorry, Rebecca. Go ahead.
Yes, I think that what Bernd just said is very important, because a lesson, even a CLIL lesson, has an affective component that we should not forget, because it has to contribute language always contributes to development of personality, so identity and all these kind of things. And this should be always an aim for the teacher, to respect the affective sphere of learning.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was clear or
I
enough.
think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the affective aspect is going to be one of the variables, isn't it? And I've put that down. Are there any
I think also just a sort of related thing is this question of what teachers do with their kids outside the main content of the lesson. You know, a lot of teachers, I think probably all teachers, they do need to have interactions with their kids which are personal and probably affective, maybe possibly to do with discipline, but not necessarily, where they make jokes and where they settle the kids down. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I've often heard CLIL teachers say that working in a second language reduces them as a teacher. And I think a lot of these sort of short, informal, jokey interactions that teachers have with students in order to oil the wheels of the lesson, I think they often need to be in the first language.
I think you might be right, and I think perhaps what we could suggest as a principle is this idea of signposting and routine. If the teacher is using an amount of L1 for a purpose that's valid in a classroom, in a lesson, it has to be done in a way that carries that message to the class, doesn't it? It has to be clear. I think what I'd like to suggest as a principle is that avoid as much as possible random code switching, which if my memory of the Russian, English and Latvian, and I speak two of those languages, is anything to go by, there's a lot of confusion when the switching is unpredictable and random and seemingly has no pedagogical function at all.
Yeah,
I agree with you. Yeah.
How would we summarize that in one sentence? So the use of L1 has to be principled and planned, or the opposite maybe, should not be random and unplanned, I suppose, what I'm trying to say.
And I think also related, sort of related to that is the idea that, especially I think in all teaching, but especially in CLIL teaching, there's got to be some explicit ground rules that the teachers and the kids, in the first language hopefully, that they agree fairly early on in the CLIL program that this is how we will learn, and this is how we will use the second language, this is how we will use the first language. We'll aim to use the second language as much as possible, but we will use the first language in the following context. You know, it's a question of coming to an agreement within the class that there are certain things that we will do in CLIL, and the use of the first language is one of those sort of agreed principles.
It's a kind of kind of definition of rules to create a setting, a kind of setting where rules are explicit and clear.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Basically, what I heard about in what you said is that we need to have some sort of encouragement for the students to use L1, because if there's random switching and so on, there's a tendency of using more and more L1 because it's easier, because it's no trouble and so on. So what I heard from John and Keith and Loretta in the sentences, in the previous sentences, was that we need some encouragement. We use L2 as far as possible, and there are certain contexts where we use where we can use L1 to make it easier for us later on to use L2.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Carry on. I'm jotting some of these down as bullet points. Very useful.
In the classroom, my experience is okay. Students, they enjoy using L2 once they find positive elements in it. But sometimes there is also a kind of laziness. Why should I use it? It takes trouble, takes time. It's much easier for me to use L1. And in CLIL we combine these two. It's okay to use L1. There are certain areas where we have to use L1, but also I think we have to make clear that the encouragement to use L2 in certain things. So I completely agree with what you said, that there shouldn't be random switching.
Yeah. Do you think CLIL,
unless the situation makes it necessary?
I was going to ask, because my feeling about CLIL possibly is that the techniques and the materials and the tasks that we do in integrating the content and language offer both that encouragement and support, I think. I think that's what CLIL really is. It's about offering the content tasks, but the language at the same time embedded within the task, so that learners who may feel they want to go back to L1 at least have the opportunity there within the task. The language is there. I think that's a central tenet to CLIL. You have to provide the language that learners may need to function within the task in the second language.
That's one of the basic differences of the practice of foreign language teaching nowadays, I think, because the theory may have changed, but in the classroom very often in language teaching we have this, being afraid of mistakes, making mistakes, no L1 and so on. And I think that's one of the advantages of CLIL, actually, what you said, that it's supposed to help students using L2. L1 is supposed to help students, encourage students to use L2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. We've got actually about a dozen bullet points here. It may not be that clear to you because we've been talking, but I've noted them down. Unless there is something else, I'm looking at the clock here, it's 5 to the hour. Do you think we can tie up? Because it's been a really interesting and rich discussion.